To me, Conan was Robert E. Howard at his best, is his great character and one of the great heroes of American popular literature.
I think screenwriting is very similar to writing comics. I mean, both are visual medium, and you'll find, especially today, that there's a lot of crossbreeding between comic book writers and artists and who are writing film and film writers who are writing comics.
Well, working with Stan Lee was probably the greatest experience of my life. I had worked for the competition, DC Comics, for 2 weeks. I met Stan on my lunch hour because he had me take a little writing test, and 10 minutes later he offered me a job. Half hour later I was back at DC and quit. I'd wanted to work for DC Comics for all these years, and I went to work for Stan for like 15. And we just had a wonderful experience. I would be there every morning on his right or left hand, and he would go over what he had written the day before on Spider-Man or Fantastic Four or Thor and show why he did what he did and where to place the balloons. I mean, all these things I'd never thought about as a comics fan. Where do you put the balloons? How much dialogue can you get in a balloon? Why do you avoid certain words, maybe because letters will close up and they'll look like dirty words. All sorts of strange things I never thought about. And it was just a real education. I was the one who had been the high school teacher for several years, but I never liked that. Stan was just a great teacher. And sometimes that would bear down a little heavy when it was on my work, but it was a wonderful experience. When I got the rights for Marvel to do Conan, we didn't have the right to adapt any stories. We just had the rights to use the character. It was deemed to be too complicated to get the rights to also adapt actual stories. I wasn't going to be happy until I got to adapt all these wonderful stories that I had read that I really loved. So I very quickly worked out with the literary agent state, Glenn Lord, to be able to pay a little extra. We ended up being able to adapt all the great stories, starting with the very fourth issue, which was Tower of the Elephant, one of the very best stories. And a little later, we were able to get the rights to the other writers, such as L. Sprague de Camp, who had written a lot of Conan stories. And eventually, we were able to adapt almost, by the time I left in 1980, we had adapted almost everything that anybody had ever written about Conan in prose up to that point. Stan had set the style for the Marvel writing starting in the early 60s, and it was heavy on a lot of thought balloons. Spider-Man was always thinking about, am I going to be able to get a date? Am I going to be able to pay for this or that? And all this teen angst and so forth that Marvel became known for. And also for great big gaudy sound effects, splang and patang, and Stan was great at inventing sound effects. When I started doing Conan about 5 years after I was working there, I decided I wanted to do something a little different from the usual Marvel comic. I just wanted it to have its own identity, so I omitted the thought balloons, because in Howard's stories, you never really got inside Conan's mind. It never told you exactly what he was thinking. So I decided I'd have captions that would give a little of that, but I would not have any thought balloons, and I would not have any nonverbal sound effect. If somebody screeches, ee, that's okay, or a growl, but no nonverbals. And I'd been doing that for about a year or so. And then I had a story come in, and Stan looked at it and said, well, this would be really good if it had a big splang right here where these two swords are hitting. And I told him, I don't do nonverbal sound effects in the Conan comics. And he just stared at me in horror, because that was part of his style. But he figured, well, by that time, the books were doing pretty well. So he said, well, I guess you're onto something, so he let it go. And so I think there was one click that got in that somebody else put in once, but in all the thousands of pages I wrote, there was never a real sound effect or a thought balloon in Conan. And I thought that was kind of an interesting little experiment, very unusual for the time. Ed Pressman was interested in producing a Conan movie back in the middle 70s, 75, I guess it was. And a friend and associate of his, Ed Summer, who ran a comic book store and art emporium in New York, was also a friend of mine. And he came to me one day and said that Ed Pressman would love to get in touch with some of the people who controlled Conan. And I explained to him, well, they weren't speaking to each other. There were feuds, and that's been a problem. So I introduced him to the literary agent, and pretty soon they all got together on this Conan Properties Incorporated, and it was putting all these various people together into one group that made the Conan movie possible, even though it took another, 6 or 7 years before the movie actually got made. And the reason the comics were so important at that time was because the books were not coming out. The Conan books had come out from the middle 60s through the very late 60s from Lancer Books, but Lancer had gone into Chapter 11 bankruptcy. So for a period of several years in the late 70s and so forth through the early 80s, the Conan stories were not available in prose form. So people only knew Conan through the comics, but luckily we were selling, you know, 250,000 or so every month of Conan, and then we had the black and white book by the middle 70s, and that was a big item. So that, as much as anything, helped make the movie possible, even though, of course, the authentic Conan was always Robert E. Howard. Ed Pressman had paid me for the work on the Conan the Barbarian movie as story consultant, and that was fine with me. And I couldn't write another sword and sorcery movie for about 1 year, but nobody was asking me to anyway, so I figured, what the heck, I'll take 10 years of that. And so in the meantime, the first movie came out, and it was nice, and it did very well. And then one day, I get a call from Ed, and whom I got along with very well, but I hadn't heard from him for many months, and he's asking me, well, what are you doing these days? I said, well, my partner Gerry, Conway, and we just wrote an animated sword and sorcery film for Ralph Bakshi called Fire and Ice, and we sold a couple of other movies. And he said, oh, that's very interesting. He says, we're about to start working on the second Conan movie, and I've got a young Australian, New Zealand director, Roger Donaldson, to do it. And he said, you should come in, you and your partner should come in, and we should talk about maybe you writing it, and because, you've got this experience now, and, and so forth. And I said, well, that's great. But I know that this is not what Ed called about, because he didn't know this. So I keep thinking, what is it he called about? I didn't get a lot of calls from producers, ordinarily. So just at a certain point, there comes this thing I call the Columbo moment, when it sounds like the conversation's over, and then Ed says, oh, by the way, like Columbo pausing at the door. He says, by the way, you remember that I paid you for being the story consultant on Conan the Barbarian? And I'm thinking, oh boy, he's going to do it again for the second movie, and that's great. And he says, well, Dino De Laurentiis is now sort of in as, co-producing the second movie in a bigger way than the first. And he says, and he's supposed to pay me back all the expenses that I paid out for the first movie. And he's written me a check, but it's made out to you. So then I see the reason for the call. He needs me to sign the check over to him so he can cash it. And I said, sure, send somebody over. Maybe it took 10 minutes for somebody to get there. I said, I'll sign it. I got my money. No problem. But because of this accident of his needing me to sign the check, he found out that we had some movie credits, and as a result, writing the first several drafts of the second Conan movie. And it was just one of these weird accidents that I kind of lucked into.